Welcome to Marin TV. I'm Peter B. Collins, and this is my latest conversation. Joining me today is Caroline Peattie. She's Executive Director of Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. Caroline, good to see you.
Thanks. Thanks for having me here.
This is the 50-year anniversary of the Fair Housing Act.
That's right.
Which was passed. It had been originally a part of the Civil Rights Act, but they couldn't get this portion of it passed. And there was a fascinating sequence of events where the Fair Housing Act had separately passed the U.S. Senate, and 7 days, I believe, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Lyndon Johnson was able to pressure the House into passing it, and then he signed it into law. What were the precursors? Why did we need a Fair Housing Act?
That's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought up the way in which the Fair Housing Act was passed, because of course it wasn't until the assassination of Dr. King that the Fair Housing Act was able to be passed. And that was, of course, because of the fact that there were riots going on all across the country, and Congress finally decided we need to do something to change things. And so that's why it finally passed. But prior to that, there was, of course, segregation, as you know, all across the country. If you look at housing and how African Americans and whites lived in the 1930s, way back in the 1930s, we think of the New Deal as being a wonderful thing, and in many ways it was. But that was the beginning of a number of federal policies that really began to separate whites from blacks. And so there were various policies put into place that did not allow African Americans to move to the suburbs, whereas their white counterparts were allowed to move to the suburbs and have very low cost, affordable loans. And so while white families were moving to the suburbs and building up equity in their homes, African Americans were forced to stay in rental units where they were paying more for rent. And there began to be, and this pattern you could see all across the country. And really there were all kinds of things like redlining, which I'm happy to talk about, but redlining and various other things that banks put into place, and people know about those kinds of things, but people don't know as much about what happened back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, as far as the federal policies that were put into place.
And these discriminatory tactics were not limited to the South. That's an impression that many people have.
That's right.
Let's focus on the history of housing in Marin County with this in mind.
Yeah.
You know, I've lived here since 1989, so I've been here a while, but I'm not a native. And the way I understand the history is that before the Golden Gate Bridge, there were a lot of rich San Francisco families who had summer homes in Marin because they could escape the fog. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious how the population expanded in the 20th century, and to what extent the legacy of discrimination was present. Did we have restrictive deeds or other ways of preventing minorities from buying property in Marin?
Absolutely. So I'd love to take us back to World War II, where we had, World War II was really a change, it just changed the face of housing in many ways. And one of the things that happened in Marin County is that, unlike other parts of the Bay Area, there was actually, when people flocked to the docks in Marin City, blacks and whites were both living in Marin City in workforce housing. They flooded in, and people didn't have enough time to segregate them. Mm-hmm. They just started handing out towels and, just pick a room. And then after World War II, and there were really, I should just say that there really weren't any problems with housing, with the non-segregated housing. And then World War II, at the end of World War II, whites began to move to other parts of Marin County. African Americans at that point could not do that, and they could not do that because of the fact that there were restrictive covenants in deeds that said they could not move to those areas. So they were forced to stay in Marin City. And if you look at the demographics of Marin County today, you know that most of the African Americans who are in this county, which is not more than 3%, live in Marin City. And that's a very specific result of some very discriminatory practices.
And when we look at those restrictive covenants, what was the origin? Were those passed by the Board of Supervisors? Were they kind of flying under the radar where the real estate industry was able to restrict access to new developments? How did it mechanically work?
There was nothing under the radar about it. It actually was just language that was put into to the deeds that said, you will not sell this house to, there cannot be somebody who is, and I can't remember exactly the wording. I can tell you that certainly Blacks were excluded, sometimes Jews were excluded, but all across the country this was standard language that was put into deeds. And you'll see it in deeds today. It's no longer legal, but it's there to remind us of our history. And so, I think when it was back in the 50s or so, there was a Supreme Court case where it was struck down as being illegal. Nevertheless, the wording in those deeds exists today.
But it's not enforceable.
No, absolutely not. And you can actually have it removed, but it's a very complex process in order to do that, and most people don't go through that process.
Do you happen to know what clause it would be in if I looked at my deed?
I don't know. I don't know that, but I do know that there have been a lot of times when people have looked at their deeds and been horrified at some of the at the wording that they've seen and have said, "Why is this here? Can we just, can we just X it out? Can we black it out?" And of course, you can't do that with a deed, but there's a process that you can go through. It's extensive, and sometimes people are discouraged by that. But I hope more people do actually go forward with trying to excise that language.
Yeah. So the problem's fixed, right? It's been 50 years under the Fair Housing Act, and there have been a few lawsuits, and that's worked everything out, and we're post-racial, right?
Wow. Well, of course not, as you know.
Irony does still exist.
Yes, that is so true. That is so true, and you use it well. But in the 50 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed, I think there have been a number of strides made. But when you look at segregated living patterns today, they still exist in the same way that they existed many, many decades ago. And one of the unfortunate things is that there are so many vestiges of the early policies that the federal government put into place. One of the things that happens is that even, as I said, in the 1930s, there were all these policies passed. And I mentioned the thing about equity. And equity is a huge piece of what happens today. So those who were fortunate enough to get low-cost, affordable home loans were able to start amassing equity. And of course, they were all white people. So when people talk about white privilege, this is one of the things that they're talking about, that they are able to, those folks who are able to buy into homes could bequeath, not only they're gaining equity, they're able to use that equity to send their children to college, to use it in all kinds of ways, to bequeath it to their children, so they pass on through generations all kinds of equity and wealth. And if you look at wealth versus income across this country, there's a big gap between an African American family and a white family. The African American family only has about 60% of the income that a white family does. But if you look at the wealth, it's 5% of the white family. So you can see that gap is huge. And there are a number of ways in which at every turn, even though there have been people of color who've been doing their best to amass equity, that it actually has not worked out because of various policies that get put into place. One example of that, if I may, is that of course, there was this idea of redlining. The redlining was this idea that you could actually, that insurance companies and lenders would actually take a red line and on a map and draw that red line and say, we're not going to insure this area, or we're not going to make loans to anybody in this area. And surprise, surprise, they were most often in communities of color. And so that was one way in which, again, the private market followed federal policies in their way of blocking people of color from amassing equity or buying a home. This next thing that happened after the redlining, as you are probably aware, was the whole, what led to the subprime debacle, which is this idea of reverse redlining. So that meant that people of color in neighborhoods of color were actually getting targeted for high-cost, unaffordable loans. And what did that do? It then, as you know, in 2008, there was this huge, we had an economic crisis, and it was really like a house of cards, the way things went. But the neighborhoods that were most affected were those neighborhoods of color. So that's another way in which there was a huge issue. And then,
and let me just ask on that note,
following, that's not the end of the story. I mean, there's more to that story. But anyway,
following the '08 recession, did foreclosures disproportionately affect African Americans who had been sold these high-risk adjustable loans?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you look at where the foreclosures happened, and I don't mean in any way to undermine what happened to other people. It wasn't just people of color who were affected, but if you look at it, it was a disparate impact on people in neighborhoods of color. So there were incredible number of foreclosures. If you look around the country at the places where there was most, where all of these foreclosures happened, the worst part was that wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't just the people who had foreclosed homes that were affected. It was also the people who were, of course, in those neighborhoods. And there are all kinds of, there's all kinds of research that shows that there were health risks, and for those who were remaining in those neighborhoods, the foreclosed homes themselves were not taken good care of by the banks. And so one of the things that happened, in fact, is that one of the things that we started investigating and looking at is the fact that these foreclosed homes were not maintained or marketed in communities of color in the same way they were in white communities. So once again, that was another way in which neighborhoods of color were taking a hit in terms of trying to build community, trying to build wealth, and so on. So when people talk about it just being an issue of green moving into Marin County, that's definitely not necessarily the case. I mean, how we amass equity, how we pass on generations of wealth has a huge effect on who can afford to buy, who cannot afford to buy.
And it's also reflected in the population of the school districts, where if you just compare San Rafael and Terra Linda, the composition, based on ethnicity, very different.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. There's no question about it.
So one of the other things, over the last 50 years that occurred was we did make, I think, a good faith effort to desegregate many communities that were highly segregated. But some of the factors that you just described about lending, redlining, and other issues led to a kind of resegregation in the suburbs. How did that play out in Marin?
Well, I think one of the difficult things that's happened in Marin is, there's not a whole lot of there's not a lot of political will in terms of building affordable housing. Here, there's a lot of talk about affordable housing, and there are ways in which the supervisors and other folks have been willing to look at issues related to affordable housing. But developing it and building it is not something that is that's favored here, and there are a lot of people who are really opposed to development, especially
Stack and pack housing.
Right.
Wind Cup is a 30-story. I mean, just the exaggerations have been incredible.
Yeah, well, Wind Cup wasn't affordable housing. You know, that was the great thing is that, you know, there's sort of anti-development in the first place, and then if you mention affordable housing, then really people really just are furious and get so up in arms about it. And there are actually a number of people who are in favor of building affordable housing, but they are not. They're not the vocal ones,
Yeah.
and it can be really difficult to address that issue because they're such a very really vociferous group of people who are just going to block whatever they can when it comes to housing, particularly affordable housing, and that's difficult. That's a very difficult thing to get over politically. There are other ways in which I think this county is trying to look at helping tenants who are at the lower income to try to stay here, because we really are becoming less and less diverse as as the county goes on. And of course,
well, and the groups that are affected are children who've grown up here, who cannot afford to live here any longer, the workforce, including critical workers like teachers and firefighters and police officers. And then there are seniors, and some of whom have built up equity, but they either can't afford or can't manage a big home anymore. And when they want to downsize, they have very few options.
yeah.
And so the very high occupancy rates, the lack of vacancy rates here of the existing housing stock we've seen the kind of increases that rental properties have imposed in the last few years.
Right.
And right now there's a controversy in the canal where what we saw a rate increase of 40% for some people who are quite vulnerable in terms of their incomes related to the expense.
Absolutely. I mean, I can speak from a personal point of view, which is that as an employer, I can tell you that half the people who work at our agency do not live in this county. And I've also lost employees because of the fact that they just don't feel like there is any change here. There's any room for change, and they've decided to go work elsewhere because they want to feel as though they're really making a change, and they don't feel that that they are able to do that here. I had a young African American man who was employed at our agency, and he told me during our exit interview that that he really was not wanted to. I mean, there were various reasons why he decided to leave his position, but he really also felt not welcomed as an African American man here, and you know, it's very painful for me to hear that, because of course I would love to change that for him, but I couldn't. So those are the kinds of things that I'd say as an employer I'm seeing, never mind even looking outwards, I can see right in my own agency what some of the effects are. And of course, you know, I have heard many, many times people talk about the fact that we don't want any more development because there are too many cars on the road, there's crowding, there's overcrowding, and of course, as you know, the reason why we have that overcrowding on the roads is precisely because people have to, you know, 60,000 workers have to drive to work in Marin County and then drive back out again to where they can actually afford to find housing.
Caroline, I want to shift for a moment to talk about Section 8, which subsidizes the housing costs for people of certain income and age characteristics. And in particular, I have a friend, she's 85, and she relies on Social Security and her Section 8 voucher to squeak by living here in Marin. Do landlords openly discriminate against voucher holders?
Sure. I mean, of course. And up until recently, it's been legal for them to do so. In the state of California, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of source of income. However, it very specifically excludes housing vouchers. And so, that would, of course, exclude Section 8 voucher holders. We there's been a coalition of people who worked with staff and the Board of Supervisors and various folks in the county to address the issue of source of income discrimination. And I'm very happy to say that in Marin County, certainly in the unincorporated areas of Marin County, it is now illegal because the Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance at the end of 2016 that said you can no longer exclude Section 8 voucher holders. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to absolutely be able to move into housing of their choice. They simply cannot be excluded because of the fact that they have a housing voucher. Mm-hmm. I mean, for some people, I think it's actually a good, it's a really good opportunity. I'm talking about landlords. It's a good opportunity because Marin Housing Authority has a great program where it's a landlord partnership program, and I know that Supervisor Connolly has worked quite a bit on this program. But it really helps landlords who've had their units damaged, or can help with a security deposit, and so on. So it's a real advantage for housing providers, and it makes it. I think Marin County has made it very, very easy for housing providers to enter into the Section 8 program. Also, the town of Fairfax followed suit, and I believe very soon that Novato has the opportunity to follow suit as well. So I'm hoping for a positive outcome there, so that my hope is that eventually all of the cities and towns of Marin County will also adopt similar ordinances.
Mm-hmm. And just to affirm what you said, I have a colleague who has been buying properties for income and rental purposes, and he actually prefers Section 8 tenants.
Guaranteed income.
Right. He said, I don't have to worry at the first of the month. I know that the payment's going to come in.
Right.
And he's had very good experience with
Right.
the tenants that he's housed under Section 8.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens is that people begin to pass on rumors. Anytime something bad happens, or anytime something, there's one bad apple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then just ruins it. And for a lot of people, in terms of this kind of ongoing rumor, and sort of people get very worried about what happens if I do this. I can't get them out. I'm not going to be able to. But no, that's not the case. And in fact, just as you said, it can be definitely advantageous for landlords to have this particular program and participate in it.
I think some of those negative perceptions come from people who are not terribly well informed, and when they hear HUD, they immediately think of the projects that were built in the 50s and 60s. And they think of them as crime-infested ghettos. I mean, there are all kinds of negative characterizations. And, some of that is based on real events.
Right.
But we don't have any projects of that type in Marin County. The closest we come is the Marin City. And talk a little bit about that, because a woman who was running for supervisor from Novato made a big deal out of the discovery of some rats at the projects in Marin City. Has that problem been addressed, and was it exaggerated in that political rhetoric?
No, I can actually tell you that there are a number of complaints that there have been about specific units in Golden Gate Village that are subpar.
Mm-hmm.
I think it varies widely, and I think that there are a lot of things that need to be fixed in Golden Gate Village. And there has been an ongoing discussion about how that's going to happen. And I think there are some very different ideas about what should be put into place, whether it's going to be mixed income, mixed use, whether it's going to be there's I think a real concern that they want that folks in Golden Gate Village want to make sure that there's no eviction of the folks who live there, and wanting to make sure that even though there needs to be a lot of work done on Golden Gate Village, that the tenants are not in any way pushed out, that they're not that they're not going to lose the community that they've been part of for sometimes for generations.
And well, let me put it this way. In the political campaign, the framing was that the Board of Supervisors have direct responsibility for Golden Gate Village. What is the truth there? Are they your boss at or the boss of the Housing Authority? You're a nonprofit group.
Yeah, I was going to say to be clear, we receive funding to provide fair housing services from the Board of Supervisors through their community development block grant funds, which come from HUD. But Marin Housing Authority is certainly, they are a county agency, so the Board of Supervisors does ultimately oversee the work of Marin Housing Authority.
Okay. And Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, has been advancing plans to raise the rent in public housing units. This seems really bizarre to me, as it's some sort of a free market opportunity scam. Are they going to raise rents in Marin?
I believe, if you're talking about for voucher holders, if it happens, if it happens at the federal level, then it's going to happen in Marin County. I've been. I think everybody who is a housing advocate has been appalled at that, Secretary Carson's ideas around that and other issues as well. He seems to be doing his best to roll back various civil rights gains that we made, particularly under the Obama administration. There are a couple of things that, one example is this is a mouthful, but the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And that has been a big deal. Just to explain what the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule has been about.
Don't say it again. We only have 30 seconds.
AFFH. That's a short. So we'll say AFFH is the short, so everybody can understand that AFFH means affirmatively furthering fair housing. It is quite a mouthful. But I wish they'd used some other phrase that was a little bit more, appropriate for a soundbite. But the Fair Housing Act, when it was passed, basically said it's not enough to say that discrimination is illegal. It's not enough to say housing discrimination is not okay. We have to go beyond that, and we have to, and I think this was in direct response to the fact that there had been federal policies that were discriminatory, that we have to do things to change things in an affirmative way. We have to do something to affirmatively change, make a positive change to further fair housing opportunities in various communities. And every jurisdiction that receives federal funding must certify that they are in fact furthering fair housing and must be able to show that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing.
And Caroline, I'm going to have to stop us there. I'd love to go further, but I'm all out of time.
Wow.
Caroline, Peattie, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.